Immunocore, as one of the hottest companies in biotech in Europe, doesn't really need an introduction, but for those of you who might not be familiar with it, it's one of the world leaders in immuno-oncology. They've really checked all the boxes to be the next big biotech in Europe, between the largest financial round of fundraising ever in Europe. I think it was 300 million euro, and besides that, having a really solid technology and recruiting top talents like Eva-Lotta herself. So with that, why don't we get started? So I suppose I'll start with the elephant in the room. Juno managed to kill 2 more patients yesterday in clinical trials. So in that context, could you talk a little bit more about your technology and why TCR is better than CAR-T?
Yes, I think what happened yesterday is just an indication that all immuno-oncology drugs are still experimental. This will happen, and we will learn more and more about the technologies going forward. We shouldn't forget that the checkpoint inhibitors have been incredibly successful so far, and even in the first 3 quarters of this year, they've sold over $4 billion in sales, and I think they will continue to grow. I think it's unfortunate with the Juno therapy, but I think they will come back. With respect to Immunocore's technology, we have a T-cell receptor-based therapy, which came out of Oxford University. It's a bispecific therapy. It's not T-cell therapy like Juno or Kite. Think of this as a therapy in a test tube, which we can administer over 15 minutes to patients and dose escalate very slowly. It's proven so far very safe, and we haven't seen many adverse events in our clinical trials. So the Tcr based approach is slightly different because you address intracellular targets. So instead of looking at the cell surface antigens, which only represent about 10% of all the druggable targets, we have the opportunity, because of the Tcr based approach, to actually address the other 90%.
But if my understanding is correct, you have exactly 1 therapy in early stage clinical trials. What makes you so confident that it's better, and how have you managed to raise so much money and be so successful though it's still early on in the development?
It's a very good question. I think, first of all, we have treated about 120 patients to date, and we're starting our pivotal registration trial in the first quarter of next year. We've published some very encouraging clinical data, both on the efficacy and safety of our drug, both at ASCO and even this month at the Society of Melanoma Research. So the drug currently in clinical trial is for melanoma. We see a particular subset of melanoma, which is very aggressive, called ocular or uveal melanoma, where there isn't any therapies today that work. The checkpoint inhibitors don't work, and something like Tcr Based, which is a chemotherapy, doesn't work very well either. So because we've been successful in the few patients we've treated to date, I think there's a lot of enthusiasm behind this drug and behind the technology as well, and I think this helped to raise money in July 15. We're very fortunate to be in the right place, and immuno-oncology is a very hot field.
Right, but some might say that immuno-oncology is overhyped at this point. Could you comment on or expand upon why, or yes, make of that what you will, but what about the hype?
I suppose this is a big leap forward. I mean, if we go back in history, when we look at cancer treatments, you had surgery and radiotherapy back in the 70s, and then you had chemotherapy in the 80s, and then you had combination of chemotherapies in the 90s, and then of course in the 2000s you started to see these targeted therapies, and I think each time there has been a step forward, to keep patients alive longer and increase success rates. I think now with the immuno-oncology field, there is potentially the opportunity to I don't want to use the C word for cure, but that is obviously the aim for the immuno-oncology approach.
I see. So with immuno-oncology, another major hurdle is commercialization, to the point that it's starting, or at least it was my sense, that it's outshining a lot of the scientific challenges. Could you speak to that as the CBO, or can you talk about what approaches companies might take, or yeah, really just anything about commercialization.
So we are a little bit away from that so far. We probably will be on the market at the earliest 2019. But of course, as I mentioned earlier, you already see the checkpoint inhibitors, which are typically monoclonal antibodies, being on the market. And of course, the first drugs that came out were approved as monotherapies and priced typically around $120,000 to $130,000 per patient per year. What's interesting to see now is that a company like Bristol Myers Squibb has 2 checkpoint inhibitors which they have approved in combination. And of course, the pricing there, when you own both drugs, is easier. And I think that's priced at $180,000 to $190,000 in the US. This will be complex when you see 2 companies coming together to actually price combination of 2 drugs that they own respectively. I think also the T-cell therapies, which very much I believe will be personalized to patients that are eligible for those, that is expensive to manufacture, it's difficult and complex to scale up. So I think that we will be looking at with interest to see how they will be priced.
I see. So regarding, I guess with public health, very much of governments tend to look at population health instead of personalized medicine. So it's, what would you like to see from governments or from policy changes or with regulation in order to really make personalized medicine possible to bring these therapies forward?
Don't know if I'm the right person to comment on that. I think the previous panel was probably more skilled in the answer to that. But I think one comment that I would make is that the goal is clearly to reach the volumes of patients globally, and not just in those countries that have the healthcare systems to provide support for these novel medicines. I think certainly our goal is to reach other markets, non-Western world markets as well with our drugs. And the way to do that is obviously to be sensible about pricing. At the same time, we're not charity organizations, so we need the support from the pricing reimbursement from the healthcare systems in each country.
I see. Okay. I'm trying to think of which question to ask you next. Could you talk a little bit more about Adaptimmune, and would you say that they're your direct competitor, or who are your main competitors, and how do you plan to outpace them?
So Adaptimmune is, you could say, is our sister company. We came out of Oxford University and we were established more or less the same time. We have the same scientific founder. He's today our chief scientific officer. The companies are completely 2 separate companies. We own 6.4% of Adaptimmune, which is a public company, and we're still a private company. Their approach is very similar to Kite and Juno and the adopted T-cell companies. The difference is that they have a Tcr based approach to T-cell therapy, so they can address the intracellular targets just like we can. But we don't see ourselves competing with them, if that makes sense, because although we both work with the Tcr based approach, our drug is a drug in a vial. It's very inexpensive. We can manufacture at low cost of goods in microbial systems like E. coli, which means that we can scale this, and we are scaling it right now to commercial scale. So that should help our pricing and also the ability to reach the volumes of patients rather than selective patients that are eligible for expensive treatments.
Yeah, that's important. So why did the co-founder pick Immunocore, do you think, or as opposed to Adaptimmune? And why are you still private instead of public?
2 good questions. I think it became difficult for him to split himself between 2 companies as the companies grew. When I joined Immunocore about 3.5 years ago, we were about 50 people, and we're close to 300 people today, and so is Adaptimmune. So with that came much larger groups of research to manage, and I think he had to make a choice. And I think his knowledge clearly was strong in both areas, but I think he feels warmly about the technology that we have at Immunocore. And maybe to comment on the second question, so the question why we remain private, we hope to continue to remain private for the foreseeable future with the current market conditions. it's difficult to say when on how long that would be possible, but certainly we're well funded at the moment. We're hoping that our next finance round will also be a private round. It's easier for companies to develop away from the limelight of the stock exchange. And we were fortunate when we raised the Series A money to have a group of very patient investors who take a much longer term perhaps than most venture capitalists do in terms of how long it actually takes to reach critical mass and return some value on investment. So we hope to maintain those investors for a very long time.
Okay, but with the CRISPR companies, the first two, Intellia and Editas, raised massive rounds, or not rounds, but IPOs. And then by the time CRISPR Therapeutics went public, it came in at 50 million euro. Are you at all worried that you'll miss the window or not raise as much as your predecessors if you wait much longer?
At the moment, we're well funded because we raised a significant amount in July 15. I think the trick for any biotech company is to go out and raise money when you don't desperately need it. So although when we raised the money, we at the time considered ourselves to be funded for about 4 years. But since then, we've accelerated our business plan, and that means that we have increased the input of internal programs and therefore also will initiate more clinical trials. And I think with that will come the need for more finance. I don't know if I answered your question there, or
I think so. I think the point that you made about going for it when you don't desperately need money, like, so get there instead of waiting for the right moment to really, not to necessarily anticipate it, but to just go ahead and just take the reins, I guess. I had another question.
Maybe I can add actually to what you were saying as well. Yeah, so going public is clearly a vehicle to actually raise significant amount of money. But if you can do that in a private market, then I think that is preferable. Of course, one day you will go public because you will have the need for secondary financing, and there's only so much private money that you can raise. I think for us, we're hoping that we can attract both European and American investors, even if we continue to raise private rounds.
Okay. But where is all this money going? You have, I understand that there's your platform, ImmTAC. What is that exactly, and where do you plan to take it next beyond multiple myeloma?
I think there were 3 questions there. Yeah, that's okay. So first of all, where's the money going? I think everybody will know that clinical trials are expensive, and we're treating a lot of patients, and each patient costs over $100,000 to treat. And the majority of the money goes into development and also to people. So, you know, recruiting good people internationally. We have 36 nationalities based in the UK and the US as well. That is where most of the money goes at the moment. And we will eventually also build an infrastructure for commercialization, which clearly is expensive as well. And I think there was a question about the technology, is that?
Yes, essentially what exactly, could you talk a little bit more about how ImmTAC works and the future applications of it?
So the technology is bispecific. It's about half the size of an antibody, so 75 kilodalton, and one end of the molecule has a soluble engineered T-cell receptor that we engineer to very, very high affinity to the target that is expressed on the cancer cell. The other end of the molecule is what we call an effector function, and that effector function in our case is an antibody fragment against CD3. What that effector function does is to act as a beacon to attract T cells to come and kill the cancer cells. So you have a very, very high affinity to the target on the cancer cell. So once our ImmTAC binds with the TCR end to the cancer cell, the other end will then flag towards the T cells to say, come and kill this cancer cell. This same technology can also be applied to infectious disease. So we have initiated some work in the area of infectious disease where we are looking at curing HIV and hepatitis B and possibly tuberculosis if the technology works. This is still early days, But if we can't cure, then we haven't really got a position in the market. But I think for us, it would be transformational if we can apply this same technology to eradicate the viral infected cells using the same technology.
I see. That's really fantastic. I don't think I've heard of a company combining both infectious disease and cancer before. Usually it's one or the other. Do you think, will that be your next clinical trial, one of those, or perhaps an HIV cure, or?
So I think HIV is most advanced, but we're still in early stage. So we've only started this at the beginning of this year. We published some research data in collaboration with Oxford University in HIV. So I think we're probably about 2 to 3 years away from going into the clinic. The next clinical asset will still be in the area of solid tumors, where we have been focusing more than 90% of our efforts.
Okay. Let's see. I think we're almost ready for questions from the audience. But regarding, are you allowed to talk about who your investors are? Is it mostly big pharma that's investing in immuno-oncology, or is it venture capital firms? Is it everyone? Who is it that's really taking an interest?
So historically, we were fortunate to have 4 high net worth individuals investing for many, many years. Those 4 individuals have actually supported us for 16 years now, because the company originally existed under the name of Labiotech. But in July 2015, we also attracted professional capital from Neil Woodford Capital, Patient Capital, and also Malin PLC, which is a Dublin-based institutional investors. So in addition to that, we have US investors, which are Baker Brothers, RTW Funds, and Fidelity Management Research in Boston. I think from our perspective, we haven't taken in venture capital, because typically it's shorter term and they're looking for returns. So there's no venture capital in the company at all. And we have one strategic pharmaceutical investor, which is Eli Lilly and Company.
So I think, yeah, Neil Woodford, Baker Brothers, they seem like really smart investors with their track record. What is it? Are you looking for anything in particular by expanding to the US besides the larger healthcare market?
Could you repeat that again?
By expanding to the US, or particularly through Baker Brothers, who are well known for their smart investments in the US, are you looking for anything in particular from attracting US investors and expanding to a larger healthcare market, or is there something else you're hoping to pull from the US?
So I think it's common knowledge that it's often easier to raise large sums of money in the US than it is in Europe, unfortunately. And that was one of the reasons we also went to the US in 2015. I think if we want to go back to raise more money, it's good to have US investors on board as well, even if it's private money. Of course, we're running clinical trials in the US. That's where we started to test our drugs in patients, and we will continue to do so. It's a large market, and it's an important market for us to be present in.
What about in Asia? European biotech companies don't normally take an interest, but some like Promethera, who's focused on cell therapy, they're really taking an interest in Asia, as opposed to, they have some presence in the US, but for now they're primarily focused on Asia. Do you see that as being a future direction as well?
So the first drug is melanoma, metastatic melanoma, and for example, that's not prevalent in Japan. So the Japanese market isn't really, applicable for the first product. There is some melanoma in China. Our technology has an HLA restriction, which is human leukocyte antigen restricted, which means that our first drug is directed against what's called HLA-A2. And that particular HLA isn't so prevalent in Asian countries. We hope to develop other HLAs also for our future drugs that are going into the clinic, so that we in parallel can exploit the Asian market. But it's unlikely, the current thinking anyway, is that we won't do that on our own, but we will do that through a partnership. Whereas our interest is really to build and retain rights to our programs both in Europe and the United States. Okay, so the last question before I hand it over to the audience.
so immuno-oncology is a super crowded field at this point. And in fact, I think there was a panel at BioEurope saying to other people who might try and get a start in it, just don't do it. Do you think that there's still space for up and coming companies in immuno-oncology, or is it really better to take some other way?
No, absolutely. They should, if they have good technologies, even if they're niche areas, please, join the immuno-oncology field, because I strongly believe that what will happen is that the checkpoint inhibitors that were first to market will continue to grow. It's always the case. And what we will see is more and more drugs will be used in combinations with checkpoint inhibitors and other immuno-oncology therapies. So I think what the pharmaceutical companies will be looking for is really combination partner to enhance their checkpoint inhibitor. And that may be indeed with a niche technology that could very much be a very different mechanism of action. So to look for those opportunities, I think is highly attractive for biotech companies, because there will be a lot of interest from the pharmaceutical industry. And I also think that, when you read data coming out, you will see that immuno-oncology will probably take care of about 60% of all cancers in 10 years' time. So 10 years from now, 60% of all cancer will get some form of immuno-oncology. I'm sure that chemotherapies will still be around, but the hope is that we can come in with more sophisticated therapies.
And so the other 40%, is that ADCs, or do you count that as immuno-oncology, or what is the other 40% that will cure cancer?
I don't know what the composition is going to be exactly, but I still think there will be chemotherapy still around, and of course you still will have other mechanism of actions that will obtain a percentage of that market. But I do believe that immuno-oncology therapies, and the targeted therapies particularly, if they are durable, which is often the difficulty, but if they can show durability, they will then survive in the market as well and claim a larger market share.
Okay, so with that, I'd like to turn it over to the audience for questions.
Hi, Bram from Merck Ventures here. Bispecific T-cell engagers like there's a strange echo. Bispecific T-cell engagers like the micromet approach have shown cytokine release syndrome problems in the past. Did the ImmTech show the same problem? And if so, how could you circumvent that?
That's an excellent question. I think to date, we do see some cytokine release. It's not a cytokine release syndrome as such, but we do see some release. What we see when we administer our drug, the first and the second dose, and we administer this drug on a weekly basis, is that the lymphocytes will leave and go into the tumor, and that causes a lymphocyte drop, a quite rapid lymphocyte drop, which can then in turn give some patients hypotension. That was our dose-limiting toxicity. Other than that, the patients are fine 24 hours later. We don't need to treat it. It comes back up. They just kept in overnight. Typically, patients do not need to be hospitalized to take our drug. They will come in for an hour and get a 15-minute infusion. I think the Amgen micromet drug, Blincyto, is a much longer infusion period. And I think they have seen some other side effects in terms of injection site reactions and so on, which we don't see, touch wood, to date with this first drug, and we hope not to see in future drugs either. So overall, the safety of our drug has been very favorable, and after 2 doses, the third dose is almost like injecting saline.
Other questions?
Thank you. So I think we're all aware of the huge funding disparity between the US and the UK and Europe in particular. I'd like to hear a little bit about your perspectives outside of funding, of the advantages and disadvantages you found of scaling in the UK versus the US.
Sorry, could you repeat that?
Sorry, so I'd like to hear your perspective on some of the advantages and disadvantages of scaling in the UK versus the US, excluding the funding disparity.
So I think my personal experience, I've been working in European companies for a few decades, should we say, including doing 2 IPOs, and both of those were in Europe. I see many UK companies and European companies going for a listing on NASDAQ and raising a lot of US capital. Clearly, the driver there is that they may be able to raise more money. But of course, the drawback and the difficulty can be that they're then competing with a lot of US biotech companies that are there in the investors' area and territory all the time. And the competition for that capital is quite harsh, but also to follow up and keep your share value up is a lot of energy that is often means that the CEO relocates or spends most of his or her life in the US to actually keep the relationship with the US investors. So I think if it's possible to maintain European companies European, that would be the preferred option. And of course, it's just a matter of whether there's enough capital to support companies, because I think we haven't got enough success stories in Europe of companies that have stayed independent, whether they're private or public. Often you see that they don't reach critical mass because of the lack of finance and therefore get acquired or sell out early. I don't know if that answered your question.
Does it?
So not talking about capital, so talking about talent, operations, other aspects of scaling in the UK, what advantages do you see?
So do you mean running clinical trials or building a company in general?
Yeah.
I think the reason we started to do clinical trials in the US was that the access to patients, it's a large market, it's a single market, compared to the European market where you have to get approval in each country to start clinical trials. We saw that it was easy to start in the home country of UK, although we don't see ourselves as a British company. We believe we're an international company that happened to be based in the UK. But in the US, you have a very large market with a lot of key opinion leaders and investigators that can run the trials successfully because they have a lot of experience from checkpoint inhibitors and other immuno-oncology therapies because they were approved in the US first. So naturally, they have more experience than the European counterparts. I think also to attract talent, a lot of European companies choose to set up in the US because you may not find the right skill base or sufficient number of people to grow in your home country where you're based. That was one of the reasons we set up an office in Pennsylvania to build clinical trials, regulatory affairs, and also eventually commercial in the US.
I actually have a question to follow on that. It's not the most exciting topic, but manufacturing is a huge deal, particularly for any sort of biological. What are the advantages and disadvantages of that, or in the UK versus the US?
So we manufacture in Europe. We don't manufacture in the UK, but in other European countries, and we have 2, soon 3 manufacturers in 3 different countries in Europe. We develop our process ourselves in-house and then transfer that to the GMP manufacturer. At this point, we didn't see it as a necessity to build because our manufacturing is quite straightforward in E. coli. So it's not a complex manufacturing process, and therefore there are a lot of very professional contract manufacturing organizations that can do that better than we can. So we'll take it to a certain scale and then transfer it across. I think eventually we may also manufacture in the US, but at the moment there's no need to.
Other questions?
I do appreciate we're just between drinks and dinner and networking. So apologies for that.
Don't feel bad. There's one more small thing after this. Sorry, guys.
One additional one from my side. You mentioned the HLA restriction of the IMTEX. From a regulatory and clinical development perspective, how easy is it once you have approval for HLA-A2 to move to other HLA classes?
It's an excellent question. So before we treat any patient, we will HLA type them to first of all make sure that we're not treating patients that haven't got the right HLA, in our case HLA-A2. And that's exactly what we will do for other HLA groups as well. And of course within France you have multiple HLA types, not just because of ethnic populations, but also Caucasian population will also represent different HLAs. So going forward, we see that that typing is a necessity in order to continue to treat. So that's one area, but also, of course, the additional area of checking that the patients are positive for the HLA antigen that we're trying to target. So there's two diagnostics, if you like, that should be done in order to increase your opportunity to successfully treat that patient population.
Yeah, my question was a little bit different. I mean, your currently molecule is only binding and have an effect on HLA-A2 class patients. Is that correct?
I couldn't quite hear that question.
Sorry. Your current lead program is only binding HLA-A2 positive patients. If you want to develop a similar molecule for other HLA class patients, you need to start from development from scratch, clinical trials from scratch, and the whole regulatory approval also from scratch, or is there some kind of shortcuts there?
Very good question. And I heard it now. So we have to start a new discovery program. So we already then know the target. It's just that we're now racing T-cell receptors against another HLA. It will be the same effector function again. So the target is the same. The construct differs with the TCR that we engineer against that particular HLA. We have not yet taken a second product into the clinic, but we believe on the preliminary discussions that we've had with the regulatory authorities that we will be able to treat this in an abridged way. So as long as we can demonstrate safety for the first program sufficiently, then we will be able to do a shorter development program and therefore could catch up. So we think of it almost as a line extension that we can continue once we see that the initial drug is doing something and we have a proof of concept in the clinic, that we can then expand into other HLA types that are relevant for that particular disease.
So I think that's all the time we have, unless there are any burning quick questions, although, is that, all right, well then let's all thank Eva-Lotta for discussing.
Thank you.